Welcome to this week's episode of the Deliberate Leader podcast. We are in for a treat this year. It is our first podcast for 2025, and I have an amazing guest joining us today, Claire Gray from Thriving Culture. Claire and I do very, very similar work, and I always appreciate her feedback, her counsel. We're part of the same accountability group, and Claire is so smart. She's really, really well versed in the area of leadership, teams, and particularly thriving leaders and thriving teams. So I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. Claire, originally from Melbourne, so my hometown. She is now up in Byron Bay with her gorgeous family, and Claire has got an amazing background in terms of people and culture leadership. She's the author of a book called Thriving Leaders. She's writing her second book, which is due to be released in 2025. So if you wanted to know more about what Claire does, jump onto her website, thrivingculture.com.au, and we'll pop that in the show notes for you. But in the meantime, enjoy this wonderful conversation with Claire Gray. Hey, Claire, how are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks. How are you going?
Yeah, good. We've covered all the important things like the hot weather, on the eastern seaboard in Australia, which is, I know, where you're from too. But by way of a very quick introduction, so people know how we know each other, we've been operating in the same space for, it must be 4 years or thereabouts. I can't remember when we met. I know I joined the Thought Leader community back in 2020. When did you join?
August 2021. Yeah.
Good. Well, so I know that Claire and I are part of an accountability group that meets every Friday. I know that I speak to my people, usually in leadership groups, about the importance of an accountability group. So you and I feel like we chat very regularly.
We do.
It's so good to have you on the podcast today. So thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
You and I operate very much in the same spaces, doing very similar things, supporting leaders really to be better, do better, hopefully for some commercial outcomes, but just for the success of themselves and their teams. And I know, Claire, everyone's heard my intro on you, but maybe, give us your, from you directly, tell us a little bit about you and what you do at Thriving Culture.
Yeah, definitely. So my background was similar to yours as well. Like I worked in people and culture for many, many years, and about 6 years ago, started my own consulting business. So it's really around leadership and team development. So really niched to focus on leadership and team development in the last 4 years. So do a lot of leadership development programs and workshops, but do a lot of work with leadership teams. So quite like working with teams, whether they're newly formed teams or they've been, working together for a long time and might be getting a bit complacent, or even it could be a siloed team, but helping teams have the conversations that they're not currently having, but also, work on real business challenges at the same time. And then I also do some keynote speaking too and coaching.
And what lights you up, Claire, most about what you do? Like at the end of a week on Friday, when you go, geez, that was an awesome week, what would that look like for you?
Yeah, good question. So probably I love helping leaders build confidence. So it's like those aha moments that they have, or when they try something out, whether it's, they've committed to doing something in a coaching session or a leadership development program, and they share the impact of doing something different to what they would normally do. And so helping them learn and grow. And the other thing would be when I'm working with teams, just them having the conversations that they have been avoiding. So helping them surface some of the elephants in the room or the unsaids or taboo things that they're avoiding, and just helping them have those more challenging conversations, but in a way that everyone sort of feels seen and heard.
Yeah, great. Well, I reckon our conversation today, I'm really looking forward to it, because I know we're going to pick up on some of these themes, and in particular things like what gets in the way. I know the language I use is deliberate leadership. So what gets in the way, and some of those things you mentioned there, like having those difficult conversations. We all know that we have to have those conversations when the time comes, but it's important to tune in and go, what's stopping me from having this conversation? So I'm really looking forward to our discussion today, because I know it'll go into those types of areas plus more. I'm sure there'll be more. Claire, you've been doing this for a long, long time, and given your background too, and now specifically the work that you do with leadership teams and leaders, and I reckon you would have no doubt, come across almost a set of characteristics or essential traits that you go, that is what makes the, deliberate leader. And if you were to describe what those traits or characteristics are, what do you reckon they are from your perspective?
Yeah. So probably a few things come to mind. Because when I think about deliberate leadership, I think about being really intentional in terms of how you're leading. And I think that comes through building self-awareness and understanding what drives you and your authentic leadership style. So I'm a big believer that we show up in different ways, and we need to show up in different ways based on the situation, and we need to dial up and dial down different parts of our personality. So whether that's being empathetic, whether that's being more assertive, whether that's being more adaptive, but we have to dial up and dial down different parts of our personality. And I think the more intentional we can be as a leader is probably one of the core characteristics. The other thing that comes to mind is probably around curiosity. So I'm a big believer that curiosity is one of the core skills that a leader needs to have. And that comes through in, if you're delivering feedback, asking curious questions so you can understand their perspective. So it's not just speaking at somebody, you're actually bringing them into the conversation. But even having curiosity when you're having coaching conversations, whether that's coaching for performance or coaching for development, because I think that's a great way that we all learn and learn from each other too. And probably the final characteristic is around that adaptive leadership. So I think, change is the new normal and all the taglines that you hear. But as leaders, we have to face into things that we haven't faced before. And I think learning our way forward and being adaptive in terms of how we lead are probably some of the key characteristics that come to mind.
Yeah, and such important ones, particularly leading right now and through it's a time, like I think we once upon a time, with all the geopolitical changes and just unrest that's occurring, I think leaders, we could have just gone, well, it's not in my area, so I'll just kind of keep doing what I'm doing. But it feels to me, and certainly the leaders that I speak to, that we can't get away with that mindset anymore. Do you see that it's having more of an influence on how leaders lead and just in their day to day?
Definitely. It's interesting because I feel like I'm having more and more conversations about how challenging it is to be a leader right now, whether that's because of the adaptive change landscape that we're in, whether it's because of leading teams where people feel entitled in this entitlement culture. But the research tells us that leaders are like, there's less people who want to go into leadership roles. I think Ari's recent report said that 4% of employees aspire to a leadership role. And then at the same time, we've got 500 people in leadership roles who are retiring in Australia every day. So we're going to have this really small pool of people who want to be leaders as well, on top of all the challenges around adaptive leadership and change and burnout and doing more with less. And it just feels like a lot for people.
Yeah. I think once upon a time too, the only path to promotion was often through leadership. I like to ask leaders this question, that is, how did you fall into leadership? Did it find you, or did you, find it? Because some people, I think, intentionally choose to lead and have it within them because they were the great, in grade 6, they were captain of the basketball team and they went on to do all sorts of things, or they're the eldest or whatever. And not that those things make up a leader, of course, but I think for some people it's really entrenched. And for some, they take it on because it's often the promotional path. But I think that's such an interesting study that you quote, because I think more and more people are opting to not, number one, it's so hard. And as you say, like the conversations you're having around it, how challenging it is to lead. So people can see that it's hard. But also I think they've got different paths for promotion and development. It's where we're certainly respecting and honouring technical proficiency in workplaces and really paying for that specialist level skill that people are bringing without having to have a team.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, most people are promoted because of their technical capability. And then people might realize, hey, I'm actually doing less of the stuff that I love doing because I'm spending more time on the people stuff. So it's really about how do you choose, promote, develop people who actually aspire to build leadership capability, or who naturally has some of those capabilities that you can help develop in a way that helps them find their authentic leadership style and be intentional so they can actually work out what is the career path they want to do. Because that's the thing as well. You can go into a leadership role and quickly decide that that's not for you. And likewise, it doesn't mean it's forever. So you can kind of dip in and dip out as well.
Yeah, you mentioned authenticity there as leadership, and I know earlier on in this conversation you mentioned showing up in different ways, and the fact that we need to, and I think that's the context and situational leadership. Depending on what is required of you, you bring that of yourself. What happens though, from your perspective, when leaders haven't quite tuned in to their authentic self? Maybe they've, tried on a few different leadership jackets and I'll put this one on today. I think this is what leadership is. So when people aren't really connected into that, their own style of leadership, in your experience, Claire, what happens for them? And how do they get themselves out of that kind of pickle if they're in that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think one of the things that I love doing with, groups of leaders is getting people to read. There's a Harvard Business Review article that's really awesome called The Authenticity Paradox. And it is that paradox of like trying on, different types of leadership to see what really fits for you. And it talks about trying to be all things to everyone and being a chameleon versus being a true to self, and how both of those things can sometimes make you fall a little bit short. And it's an interesting one because it's this balance. And the reason I like the conversation that the authenticity paradox brings to a group of leaders is it really polarizes people. People really feel very strongly that you should always behave in the way that you always behave, and others feel like they can adapt or try out different leadership styles. And what happens when people are in situations where they're behaving how they think they should behave and it doesn't feel true to their authentic style is they end up feeling zapped. They feel burnt out. They feel like they're putting on a mask, and that can be really exhausting and really challenging. So often taking a step back and kind of thinking about like purpose and values, and so that you can actually really carve out, how can I be an intentional leader, and what is the leadership intention that I want to bring every day, and how do I actually share that with people so they can hold me accountable to the leader I want to be as well. So I think it's challenging. I do think observing how other people lead, often it's the bad, that I shouldn't say bad leaders, but the leaders that maybe we don't want to be like, and we often learn a lot from those leaders. But we also take different leadership capabilities from other people around us too. And I think it's about experimenting a little bit with what feels right for you.
Yeah, you touched on some really important stuff there, because we do, it's a bit like parenting, for those where that example resonates, but we often parent in the way that we have been parented and we lead in the way that we've been led, but
Yeah.
it's like picking up all those bad habits. And if you're not tuned in to the fact that that is not going to be conducive to your team's success or high performance, but you've seen it and you've experienced it before, people will just roll out the same thing because they think that it works, not really being wiser around some different methods or processes that might better engage their team.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we get a lot of behaviors ingrained in us, like you've said, from, our parents, from the people that have led us before as well. And often we don't actually have any support to develop those leadership capabilities. I think statistically, most people move into their first leadership role between the age of 30 to 35, but don't actually have any training till 40 to 45. So everyone's kind of learning on their feet. It's kind of sink or swim. And they're doing their best. And then it's that whole unlearning and relearning that can feel quite challenging. And it's not about changing your whole leadership style, but it's, the one percenters of, maybe that could be a more effective way to have a conversation. Or maybe I don't give the answer and ask a question to see if they can come up with their own solution. And it's often just those little one percenters that I think make a huge difference.
Yeah, that's right. You mentioned curiosity too as one of these core characteristics. And I know leaders, often they're challenged by, I know I need to be more curious. I know I need to ask more questions, or I know I need to stick my head out of my organization every now and again, or out of my team, and kind of see what's going on. The comment I get back often enough is, gee, that takes a lot of time, Rita, and I just don't have the time. We're kind of on this little spinning cycle, and we've got to keep going, or hell will break loose if it stops, which of course it doesn't. What advice have you got for leaders, if they really want to connect in with being a bit more curious for various reasons, right? What's a few tips that you've got on how they can do that?
Yeah. I feel like there's a common misconception that I don't have the time to coach or ask questions, and it's much quicker to give the answer. So I just want to put it out there. I don't think every moment is a coaching moment by any means. We still need to be directive. We still need to set expectations. We need to be assertive at times as well. But if it's a learning opportunity, if it's an opportunity for us to think a bit more differently, or rather than going just with habitually what we always do, asking some curious questions. And it doesn't have to be this hour-long formal coaching conversation. It can just be asking more open-ended questions, so more what and how questions, just to really break it down to something very explicit. If you ask more what or how questions, and avoid asking lots of leading questions, because often we ask the suggestion that's masked as a question. And I was very guilty of this. Like I was like, oh, I'm a good coach when I first started exploring coaching when I was a people leader. And I was just really telling them, have you done this? Could you try this? And it wasn't actually an open-ended question. And so just asking some more what and how questions can just be a really useful reframe as well, and just see what comes back and what type of conversations come back, because you'll see the benefit of it pretty quickly.
I reckon, Claire, when you just said, let me be very clear, not everything's a coachable moment, I reckon a lot of leaders have just gone, oh, thank God.
What a relief. Yeah.
So true. Like we don't, for me, coaching in leadership it's something you've got in your toolkit, but there's a time and place. So, I mean, we've already spoken in this conversation about things needing to be situational and the context needing to match what you need to do. But yeah, I think a lot of leaders get confused because for different reasons, but particularly commercial, you've got to drive the performance of the team in the business. And that does mean, as you say, sometimes being directive and sometimes knowing when to apply what method. So yeah. I'm breathing a sigh of relief with everyone else. Thank you for sharing that. Claire, in this conversation, you've mentioned adaptive leadership and being adaptable. It was one of the traits that you mentioned. And, leaders often, I think, they can be criticised for being a bit flip-floppy. And what I mean by that is that they may not hold to a particular decision that they've made because they want to be adaptable, and then they receive a new set of data or a new bunch of information that means that they've got to change course, which can make their team kind of get a bit confused, particularly if it's not messaged and communicated well. But how do you think leaders should best navigate this balance between adaptable leadership, but also staying true to being a deliberate leader, and particularly their principles and the decisions that they make?
Yeah. So I think coming back to purpose and values and anchoring to those can be really good guiding principles to anchor to as a starting point, especially in the context of deliberate leadership. I think also if we think about adaptive leadership, it's about us learning our way forward. And with that comes us being a bit vulnerable that we don't always have the answer and things might change. But I think what happens is we sometimes underestimate or don't communicate either enough, or we communicate too much information. We need to get that balance right. So often it's about communicating when you don't have the answers, so people actually understand that, but giving them some certainty about when you're going to come back to them with more clarity. So even if you're just going to say in 2 weeks we'll have another meeting and we'll come back with some more clarity, you're giving them some certainty that they can anchor to, but you obviously need to follow through with it. I think also things do change, and often when there's change happening as leaders, we want to highlight all the benefits of all the change that's happening, and we kind of sugarcoat everything. We ignore all these fears that are probably quite real for the people that are going through the change. And as a leader, you're probably going through the change as well yourself. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge what people are fearing and have conversations about what they're fearing and what might be holding them back adopting the change. It doesn't mean we don't still highlight the benefits, but we have to acknowledge some of the loss that people are feeling, because often when we don't do that, people feel, I guess, that the change, like people don't understand what the change really means. And I think it shows that you actually do understand what the change means as well. So I guess in terms of deliberate leadership, communicate regularly with your people and keep it kind of bite-sized pieces of information so it's not overwhelming for people, and treat them as people and ask questions about how they're feeling and actually acknowledge some of the loss that they might be experiencing too. Because I do think people experience change in very different ways, and don't assume that people are going to be experiencing it in the way that you are too.
Yeah. And we've all, often, not always, but leaders, we often have more time to digest the information because we've heard it from elsewhere, maybe a few days before, hopefully, not always, sometimes it's an hour before.
Yeah.
And you're tasked, particularly in that middle level leadership, you're then tasked with communicating. But we do have that benefit of sitting with it for a little bit more time. What you were saying there, though, reminds me, particularly around the fear, and acknowledging that fear is important. My dog does this funny thing, and I know a lot of dogs do, but he'll put half his body under a chair and then the rest of his body's out. Usually it's his head. And it's his way of going, I can't be seen here because I'm sure I'm kind of hidden. And it reminds me of leaders kind of going, oh no, if we don't acknowledge it, like there's no fear or there's no change or there's nothing to see here because we've only half kind of hidden the most obvious part. And it's important people's bullshit radar is usually kind of standing upright, and they can sense when there's something that's not quite right or they're not being given the full picture of information.
And it's such a challenge. Like even in the last few weeks, I'm just reflecting as you're saying it of your dog, of some conversations I've had with some leaders of, there's a big change coming that we know about at Exco level because it's within a global business, but we're not going to communicate anything yet because we don't want to cause anxiousness or ambiguity for people, which is fair enough. But then sometimes we still go too far the other way and we don't actually communicate enough as well. And people aren't silly. They know if it's in the media, they already kind of know about it. So let's start having conversations about what it actually means too. And it's this real conundrum. Like last year, I feel like I had less sessions on managing people through change and more on leading through ambiguity. So, how do you keep people productive when you don't have the answer? And it was really pitched at those middle managers who aren't part of the decision making process, who are experiencing the change at the same time that their people are. Like, how do we keep people productive and focused on what they need to do and not get distracted by all the noise? And often it could be from a government perspective because change is happening and it's taking so long for answers to come through. There's some corporate companies where the speed and pace of change, it's just change on change on change. And it's really hard to navigate as a leader because it's a lot to keep people focused on the day to day and start adopting new ways of doing things as well.
And I reckon the leaders that do it better, the ones that I've experienced and either had as leaders or observed, are the ones that integrate all the stuff we're talking about, right? Whether it's coaching, anything to do with being a more intentional, deliberate leader, it's those that integrate it as part of the way that they turn up and do what they do, as opposed to those that go, oh, no, I'm doing my operational work. And now, oh, it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'll switch to leadership now. It just doesn't work. And,
No.
I think when we continue to try and compartmentalize, and whether it's, well, I won't communicate this now because I'm kind of busy doing my operational work, I think they're the ones that get into a real pickle.
Yeah. Well, that's it because it feels like something they have to do rather than it being integrated into how they work. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what. So what I'm hearing, and I hope everyone else is hearing this, but it is that integration and adopting rhythms and practices, which mean you're just doing it all the time. Right? And that way it actually takes less brain power because you're adopting it as something you need to do all the time.
Yeah.
Claire, I reckon that we've talked about leaders that learn by being led in the way that they've been led, and that can lead to, I reckon that can lead to some myths and misconceptions about leadership. And also, plenty of others, because we might hear something that someone else is doing and then we go and adopt it and go, oh, that's not going to work. What do you reckon are the biggest misconceptions, particularly around deliberate leadership, and how can leaders overcome them or address them?
Yeah. Well, I reckon one of the fundamental misconceptions about a leader is that they need to have all the answers, I think, and hopefully everyone feels relieved. I'm not going to tell you a secret, you don't have to have all the answers. But I think as a leader, it's about being a facilitator, especially of a team, and really thinking about the fact that the sum is better than the parts. And how do you actually leverage the strengths of your team? How do you actually get your teams having the difficult conversations with each other and having that healthy, challenging debate so you can come up with a better solution, and empowering your team to be able to take some ownership to drive things forward? Because it is about kind of mobilizing people on real challenges. And I think this misconception that you need to be the smartest person in the room, you need to have the answers, you need to, be the first one to speak or the last one to speak. All those misconceptions, I think, can trip leaders up. I also think, and look, I was totally guilty of this, and it kind of links to having all the answers, is when I first started, like, learnt the skill to coach myself. Before that, I was such a great problem solver. I was such a rescuer, dived in with my team to come up with the answer or give, because I thought that was helpful, but it actually really disempowered them. And I think often we want to be helpful, we want to help our team, but sometimes we're actually taking away their power and we're disempowering them. And a better way is, by taking a coaching approach, we can help leaders get the best out of their teams too. And probably the last one that comes to mind is the fact that we need to have nice cultures. Like, I do think that often nice cultures really avoid having tough conversations. They become quite passive. And I think there's a bit of a misconception that psychological safety, which is the ability to be able to take interpersonal risks as a group, that means that you have to be nice to each other all the time. And psychological safety is way more than that. It's about being able to be vulnerable, share your mistakes, challenge each other, have the difficult conversations, hold each other accountable. And I think people think a nice culture is a productive culture. And I actually think it's probably the opposite, because people step over issues, they avoid having conversations that should be had, and it stops the team from learning. So I think that's another common misconception I see.
It's like sickly sweet, like,
Yeah.
and that's where that disingenuous stuff comes into, or that feeling of something's not quite right here because we're hiding it. We're not, confronting conversations that we should be. We're trying to keep it all kind of perfect looking. Yeah, I agree. Definitely not striving to, for those nice cultures. As you were talking about particularly ownership and not having all the answers, it made me think about the value. So the value that a leader, or the perception of their value and the value that they bring to the team.
Mm-hmm.
Do you reckon that's kind of built into this, or do you see that as a common misconception? And I guess to give you a little bit more context around this, I think that if leaders haven't fully understood the value that they bring, then they look to have themselves measured against these very, rudimentary value signs, like, do we all get along? Or, is the work getting done? Are we meeting our KPIs, which is important, by the way? I would never say don't meet your KPIs. I don't know, what's coming up for you around this whole thing around the value that a leader has and how they measure themselves? Is it unique to every leader, do you reckon?
I do think it's unique. I think some leaders are doers, so they will want to be doing the doing. And I think, as you're saying about how they're valued, what's coming up for me is leaders who want to be liked. And so then it's like, I've got examples where there's a leader of a really large team, and they might be avoiding having the difficult conversation of who actually really needs to sit on this leadership team. And it's because they don't want to hurt people's feelings because they want to be liked, or they don't want to disappoint people. But unfortunately, leadership, I shouldn't say unfortunately, but leadership is the art at disappointing people at a rate that they can tolerate at times as well, because we do need to face into some of those more difficult things. And so if we're putting value on keeping harmony or value on being liked or other things like that, sometimes we can lose sight of the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be empathetic and care for people, but it's more about sometimes because we maybe dial up our empathy too much, it might cloud our judgment in the decisions that we make. So I do think it's very individual to the leader. And I think it comes to their values as well, and what they value and how they feel valued by others too. And the other thing that's interesting is, are they being judged or valued or assessed on their value from the people that they lead themselves? Is it from other stakeholders? Is it from the board? Like, it can come from different places too. And often those stakeholders have different expectations of the leader too. And so sometimes that disconnect can be really challenging.
Yeah. And I think if you're the type of leader that's spending a lot of time on trust and connection and engagement, even when you do have those wobbly moments in the team where, it doesn't feel like a nice culture and it doesn't feel like it's smooth sailing, I think those strong underpinnings of like trust, engagement, the fact that we can move into tough conversations, it's all the Lencioni stuff, right? So the Lencioni talks about it around the 5 dysfunctions of a team, but those that are not aware of that framework, it's really focusing on trust, productive conflict, commitment, results, and accountability. And I missed accountability because it's before results. But I reckon that's when you, as a leader, when you're placing your value on whether those things are right in the team, and when you work hard to set those things right in the team, then I reckon you can withstand a disagreement or a tough conversation, or those things don't make or break it, but because you've got that strong underpinning. I guess it's like any relationship, really.
Yeah, definitely. I think the combination of trust and psychological safety as a team, because trust is more on a one-to-one relationship level, whereas psychological safety is that group norm that's created. And those two things hand in hand is what's going to build a strong relationship. I absolutely love Patrick Lencioni's model, and it is one of the thought leaders that I've used to develop my Thriving Teams model. I think the limitation with that model, though, is it doesn't actually look at stakeholders. So it looks at the team very insular to the team itself. And we probably need to have more of a systemic look, as I just said, around the expectations and the relationships we have with all our different stakeholders, and where there could be conflicting expectations. How do we actually manage that, and how do we actually get alignment? Because that's really critical.
Oh, it's such a good point, because I think, and it goes back to this point around value. So if your stakeholders, other than your direct reports or your team, are not measuring you against their kind of set of measures that equates value for them, then you're particularly in a bit, or potentially in a bit of trouble if there's that misalignment there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, because the board's going to look for certain things, and your CEO will look for certain things, and your peers in another team might look for certain things. Yeah, so it is really having that full 360 view.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's almost impossible to please everyone as well. And so it's about what's realistic and what's going to help us, achieve the vision and live up to our purpose as a team that we've created. Yeah.
Claire, throughout this conversation, you very generously shared a couple of leadership lessons that you picked up along the way as you were leading people in an earlier part of your career, and obviously still now because you've got your team. What's been the most memorable lesson or piece of advice related to deliberate leadership that you've learned, and one that if you were talking to a group of freshly minted leaders that you would share with them based on your experience?
Yeah. So there's probably two examples that come to mind, and they're both at my time when I worked in financial services in people and culture. So I worked at NAB for 10 years, which was an awesome place to work and learn best practice in terms of leadership and as well. So I really value my time there. So probably quite early on in my career, because I started there when I was in my early 20s, and I got told very quickly that you need to speak professionally, you need to have the corporate speak, and you need to be polished. And so I remember that advice quite early on, and which meant that I ended up speaking in TLAs, which for most people know that's a three-letter acronym for a three-letter acronym. And so sometimes when you start speaking in TLAs, no one knows what you're talking about. I'd sort of nailed that professional corporate jargon. And then I moved up because I was in Melbourne, and then I moved up to Byron Bay about 8 years ago. And I was facilitating a CEO masterclass with 16 entrepreneurial Byron Bay CEOs. It was a year-long program that was I developed for Oz industry. And so we had a mixture of CEOs who they were all very successful, but they were either came from this entrepreneurial background or they'd come from small business. And I sort of came in with my corporate badge of honor, and it just fell like a ton of bricks. And I look back thinking, oh, what was I thinking? Anyway, and it just made me realize that like I had to unlearn the corporate jargon and actually just start speaking as a person and as me. And I think sometimes we talk about this authenticity, which is quite ironic because I talk a lot about authenticities. When we do that, we lose our sparkle. We lose what makes us us. And I feel like that was probably one key learning, and it's something I reflect on all the time because we kind of get into this work speak and trying to dial it back so we're actually just speaking human to human like we would if we were having any other conversation. And the other thing that comes to mind, which I actually share in my book, Thriving Leaders, is from a leader called John Cox. So he is now the CIO of Coles, or he's at least for the next month. But he was a senior technology leader, and I was the people and culture business partner. And this is years and years and years ago. And we were interviewing some candidates for, I think, a head of roles in his leadership team. And we were talking about a candidate we just interviewed, and I had given some very direct comments, and I sort of tried to backpedal and kind of, backpedaled with what I had said to kind of soften my message. And I just remember very, very clearly in the dark, dingy room that had no natural light. John and I were laughing about it when I chatted to him about sharing the story in my book, that he said to me, what you actually said was really valuable, but instead of trying to soften the message after you've said it, but take a moment to pause and think about what is the actual message you want to deliver, and then you'll have a far more impactful conversation. And so it was really about softening my message up front. And I think why that was so impactful for me personally was because he actually gave me a suggestion of what I could do differently next time. And it was very tangible and I could really understand it, but I also trusted him. I had quite a strong relationship with him, but it was really lovely that he went out of his way to give me that feedback, because he could have just walked past that, but he didn't. And I think that is a great example of deliberate leadership.
Yeah. Wow. So great examples. Having worked in financial services now, I do a lot of stuff in health. My gosh, all the acronyms. You often need a glossary or your own little dictionary and it's so embarrassing when you're the new person or the leader and you're like, sorry, what does that stand for? And
yeah, what does that mean? Yeah.
Right. Like you just need to keep the language simple, and that way it's a lot more inclusive too for everybody. And it means your message can be accessed by other people But yeah, that whole, must be polished. I mean, I remember very early on in my career, and this is going back a long time, and the example will give away age and stage, but I remember being told to, not turn up for a promotional interview in a pair of pants, that I had to wear a skirt and that I had to be,
Really? Wow.
polished. Yeah, polished and and it was in the same sector. So I'm so glad that we are now embracing people's authenticity, and dress codes have completely changed, but it's more than the vain presentation. It's that people are encouraged to come in and to be truly who they are. And as long as you're connecting with your strengths, you're leading with those, you've got a better opportunity to build a more genuine relationship.
And I reckon that was seriously one of the blessings from COVID, because I feel like the work style changed. People had been seeing each other's, houses and all that kind of stuff. It built trust. People felt more like they could be themselves. And I know there's all this stuff happening over in the States, kind of rolling back at some of that. And hopefully that doesn't end up having any ripple effect into Australia, because I do think we've come some way, but we've still got a fair way to go too.
Yeah, I think everyone's looking at what's going on there in disbelief, because it's taking us back
Yeah.
decades, which is such a shame for all the work that's been done to try and get us to a stage where we're at, which it wasn't perfect, but we've still got, we're making dents. We hadn't achieved, I guess, the level of progression that we wanted to. And I'm speaking even just from a gender equity perspective, but it's frightening to hear all the stuff that's going on right now.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to digress ever so slightly. My son, who is about to turn 8, that's his first yearbook, and he asked us in the car the other day, what was my first word? And I was like, oh, Jackson, my eldest, I was like, his was dark. Oh, I've got your first yearbook. I'll have a look when we get back. And felt bad. My second child's first yearbook's not completed. So now it's out, and I spent the weekend going through photos, which we're going to print off. But what was really interesting, my 10-year-old, because there's a page that said what was happening at this time in politics, who was the president, who was the prime minister, all these things. And 10 years ago, there was unrest between Russia and the Ukraine, and Gaza and Israel. And then in my son's 8 years ago, Trump. And I was like, it is really like we're going back in time, all the progress that's happened. But look, who knows what will happen in Australia? We're a different country. So fingers crossed that we don't, go too far back.
Yes, tariffs imposed on us, as they are, as we speak, being other countries.
Yeah.
Yeah, that softening so John Cox, I think you meant that. What a great relationship. And obviously I'm assuming it's still kind of alive today, given that you quoted and you recounted that story in your book. That advice that John gave you at the time about softening it at the time, as opposed, because it's gosh, I've learned this lesson many, many times, or maybe I haven't learned it because I keep doing it. But once something has left my mouth, then you just go, oh, I actually can't take that back. Like, I can't change it. I would have subbed out a few words. So what did you do? Like, did you have any particular prompts for yourself that have helped you soften that message since you received that feedback that maybe you still use today?
Yeah, it's really interesting because when I think about it, I feel like my first initial response was in my head, oh shit, I should be the one giving the leader the feedback, not the other way around, given my role. So I had that moment. But then what I did was I really tried to have the power of the pause. I don't always succeed with the pause either, but it's just something I'm a lot more conscious of. And I think I'm a lot more intentional and thoughtful with the words that I use now as well. I think some of that comes with experience and learning the hard way and all those things, but I think being a little bit more intentional. Yeah. And like, I'm naturally a fast-paced person. I speak fast, I think fast. My pause is probably quite fast as well. So, just also being conscious of those things as well.
Yeah. I know in facilitation, I'm sure this will resonate for you, but and even as for leaders, when you're asking your team something, or as facilitators, when we ask and you kind of get nothing. And I've had to master over the years, like, how long am I prepared to just sit here and just gently make eye contact with people in the room, and I reckon, I say this to teams, like, you get up to the 12-second mark, that is punishing and grueling to get up to 12 seconds and kind of have nothing. But it's so powerful, and it means that I think as leaders and as facilitators, we realize we don't have to fill that space. So at that point, the accountability is actually on the group. And if they're reflectors and if they're thinkers and if their pause is going to be a little longer, then it's about giving them the time and space to really take that pause. I reckon 15 seconds is my max. What do you reckon, Claire?
I reckon you're probably better than me then. I reckon I'm at probably 10 to 12 seconds, I think, because it can be hard in those moments. And sometimes having a little lighthearted joke around it to kind of let people know that you're not going to fill the space for them can help. But what's really interesting, like when I do coaching training, when people come back, the leaders come back after they've practiced and someone's practiced the pause and they're like, oh my gosh, I felt so uncomfortable for you. That would have been felt so awkward. And the other person always says, oh no, I just gave me time to think. Like I didn't even realize that was awkward. So it's more awkward for the person who's asked the question, or the facilitator or the leader than it is for the person sitting at the other end as well. So a lot of, I guess, coaching is managing ourselves and what's actually happening internally for ourselves in those moments too. So whether
Yeah.
like you, well, I don't know if you count in your head to kind of make the time go past and feel less awkward for you, but whatever technique you use, you're probably going to feel more uncomfortable than they are.
Yeah, because at that point, as a leader, like if you've asked a question, whether you're individual or in a team, you've now given something for that person to do, so that it's the onus and accountability is now on them, and they're not going to be even thinking about, oh, how long have I kept that person waiting? They're just going to be thinking about the answer and the thought starter that maybe you've prompted them with.
Yeah.
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 Gee, Claire, it actually leads in nicely. You've already given us so many of these tips as you've gone through, but specifically now I want to focus on leader mindset, because I reckon part of being a deliberate leader is intentionally adopting a mindset. And so I talk a lot with leaders about your energy and the fact that energy is a much more precious resource actually than time, because I have no control really over time. I can control what I'm doing with my time, but my energy I have much more control, because I can control how I create more energy, how I'm using and expending my energy. So in terms of mindset, what practices or strategies do you find useful for leaders to adopt to make them more deliberate in their approach?
Yeah. So I'll probably just like pick up on something I said earlier, but I've also got something else in mind too. So developing your leadership intention is really important. So like reflecting on what does deliberate leadership, I actually say what does thriving leadership look like, but it could be what does deliberate leadership look like to you, and actually really reflecting on what that actually means to you and coming up with an intention. Often reflecting on your strengths. I'm a big advocate. And when you're doing a leadership intention, I suggest doing the values in action survey, which is a free survey that you can do. I like using Gallup survey for other purposes. But when you're coming up with a leadership intention, because it really is your values in action. So it's a great way of actually thinking about your strengths and who you are. And reflecting on that, and then actually coming up with these 4 to 8 sentences around this is the intention I have when I lead, and sharing that with others, I think is really powerful. I think also in different moments, what are you telling yourself about the situation? So another example is if you're giving feedback to someone and you're feeling really frustrated, you're kind of pissed off, they're going to feel that in your tone of voice. And look, I've probably learned the hard way, delivering feedback as well, and probably how you actually feel it comes through in your tone of voice and your body language, even if you're using the right words. So until you actually have a mindset that you want someone to learn and grow, or have a positive intention for giving that feedback, like you want them to understand whatever it might be, that's then the time to give the feedback. So you kind of need to, again, it could be like extending on the pause, going for a walk, or giving yourself a bit of space between the situation and the conversation that you're going to have, so that you can have the right type of conversation. It doesn't mean as a leader you can't show emotion. We do want you to be human as well. So I'm not saying that you need to be wooden. It's the word I was going to say, cardboard, wooden. But it is about kind of managing the emotions when they're not going to be constructive or productive as well. So they're probably kind of 2 mindsets I think are important.
They're hugely important. It builds on nicely. You mentioned the pause a few times, which I think is so important. And again, for me, it comes back to this value thing, because if as a leader you place your value on, I've got to have the answer, I've got to be responsive, to pause, some leaders see it as a sign of weakness. And for those that hold that, I'd be saying, no, like that to me is a massive myth or misconception, because the pause gives you time as a leader to think, to really, I love what you've just said there about like really channeling your intention and waiting until you've got that positive intention, because otherwise we end up, hopefully it's inadvertent and not intentionally, but we end up creating harm because we've not been thoughtful or considerate enough with what we want to say. And then I think the essence of our the essence of the message is lost because they've missed it, and you've missed it because you've not really thought clearly and in a considered way about what you want to say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
If leaders could all take just a bit more of a breath and just realize that going slow is not weakness. And in fact, for me, I've learnt, particularly over the last decade, that it's a lot more empowering. And I don't backtrack as much on my decisions because I've given myself time to really think, and then I don't have to have the recovery conversation because I've gone and said something without really thinking. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's something that I'm personally quite conscious of, because I feel like even last year, I personally felt like I took on too much, so therefore my team took on too much. And so this year it's about like, well, let's just focus on a few things and do them really well. And that requires us saying no to things, slowing down, all those sorts of things, so we can actually produce something better. And yeah, it's hard not to, especially at the moment, it's February 2025, it's the start of the year. Everyone's back at work and it's kind of like back on the hamster wheel and everything gets busy, and that it's like, how do you stop yourself getting caught up in the busyness and slow things down a bit?
Yeah, I was reflecting on that actually over the weekend, and I know you and I spoke on Friday, um and we shared a couple of text messages over the weekend, and I did reflect, like January coming back after the break, I felt so refreshed, and you could see it, that there was a sense of calm. And then we're kind of two full weeks into the new year in terms of work and kids back at school, and this frantic kind of energy that can sometimes pop in has come back up, and I'm like, hold on a minute, it was only 2 weeks ago that things were feeling so chill. And I
Yeah.
think there's something in there for all of us. I know I saw, or I heard rather, someone say today that Feb is known as the Feb fallout month because all those intentions and resolutions, if you are a resolution type of person that you set in January, this is when you've had time to really make it a habit if it's going to stick. And for most of us, it doesn't. And
Yeah.
as you say, it's really easy then to go into that routine that is almost like, it's like muscle memory. It's so familiar to us because it's just what we always do. But I think what some of that advice, all of it actually, Claire, that you've given around just taking the pause, being more intentional and really thinking clearly about what you want to do, I think will hopefully help people just to adopt that. No, I don't need to jump on that hamster wheel again.
Yeah. And I feel like we just constantly need to remind ourselves and catch ourselves, because I'm guilty of it too. And it's like, oh, okay, no, we don't want to go back to that exhaustion that a lot of people were experiencing at the end of last year.
Yeah, and no good decisions are ever made from that. And I think it fits in beautifully with what you've said there around that intention. What's that positive intention that you want to have on the person, on your team, and even for yourself?
Yeah, definitely.
Hey, Claire, thank you so much for joining us today on the Deliberate Leader podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. And I always love like all the notes and scribbles that I take from these conversations because they're nuggets of gold. And I'm hoping that people, if you've just listened to this for the first time, go back, because I think particularly some of your quotes and your memes, like Claire memes in there, are just gold in terms of how people can lead more deliberately.
Oh, thank you so much, Rita. It was an absolute pleasure.
No worries. See you very soon.
Thanks. Bye.
It was such a pleasure to speak to Claire Gray from Thriving Culture today. Gee, so many things to take away from that conversation. Claire gave us an insight into what are some of those key characteristics of deliberate leadership. And specifically, she talked about being able to show up in different ways as a leader. So having that really adaptive nature to how you lead. She also spoke at length about curiosity. And we talked in our conversation about how we find the time as leaders to be a little bit more curious, because it does take time. It does require moments of pause so we can really think about what we want to be curious about, and we can almost think about thinking and what we're going to think about. Claire referenced some really good pieces of research, particularly around what's keeping people from leading. Not everybody wants to adopt leadership right now or take it on because of the challenges in leadership. A couple of times Claire referenced this anchor to values and purpose, and really without understanding what those values and purpose are for you, it makes it hard to be a deliberate leader. And probably one of my favourite parts of the conversation, whilst I loved it all, was, what Claire finished up with, which was that intention and having that positive intention as a leader. And particularly as we think about difficult conversations that we need to have we taken on that positive intention and really thought about what are the ramifications of this conversation on that person? Do I want to deliver it with positivity in a constructive way? Or if I'm caught off guard and maybe I'm a bit frazzled, I'm bouncing around from thing to thing, my focus is very much dispersed across different things, is that going to impact my feedback and how I show up for this conversation and my intention? You hopefully have taken away a bunch of things, as I have, from this conversation. So thank you very much, Claire, and I'll see you next time on the Deliberate Leader podcast.